Okay, everyone. So we should be live, and welcome to Critical Thinking lesson number two. So let me just check that everything's working okay. If you're watching the recording of this, just skip ahead a few minutes, because it's a live lesson. I just like to make sure that everything's working okay. And welcome. Let me just check. And it is working okay. Excellent. All right. So we still have a couple of minutes before we start. So again, if you're watching the replay version of this, just skip ahead a couple of minutes until we begin. Just going to wait a couple of minutes because Facebook takes a couple of minutes to notify everybody, and there's some important stuff at the beginning. So let me see. Okay. Wait one more minute. Okay, so in the last lesson, what did we look at? We looked at what critical thinking was, the difference between critical and uncritical thinking. So a good way to think about critical thinking is not criticizing people or criticizing things. It is about not being uncritical. So uncritical means that you just don't you take everything at face value. You believe everything you read. You believe everything you hear. But critical thinking means that you're applying skepticism to things that you hear and things that you read. So if you didn't see the last lesson, go and check that out. You'll find it here in the group. And it's this search for objective truth. A really good way of thinking about critical thinking is the scientific method. So if you're a scientist and you are running tests, you're not trying to prove that you are right. You're not trying to, I am Chris Pell and I want to show everyone that my theory is correct. No, you're looking for the truth that might prove that you're correct, or it might prove that you're not correct. It doesn't really matter who is correct or who is not, because you're searching for the objective truth. And in this lesson, we're going to look at how to make a reasonable argument. How can you search for reasonable truth if you yourself are not reasonable? So the thing that we're looking for is to find objective truth, to find reasonable truth. But in order to do that, you must be reasonable yourself. And in order to be reasonable, you need to know how to make a reasonable argument. And how to use reason to make an argument. We'll show you how to do this in this lesson. And the difference between assertions, arguments, and conclusions. And when I'm talking about conclusions in this lesson, I'm not talking about the last paragraph of your task 2 essay. I'm not talking about conclusions in that way. I'm talking about them slightly differently. And it's really important you understand the difference between an assertion, an argument, and a conclusion. How the above can be used to improve your IELTS performance. So we're not just teaching you about critical thinking, we're teaching you all about how you can apply critical thinking to your IELTS performance, and that is going to help you. Okay, so let me just check that everything is working again before we begin. Sorry if you're watching the replay, but I like to make sure everything's working. Okay, and Manu says hello. Manu, hello. Okay, so the reasonable person. In order to be a reasonable person, you must use reason when communicating with other people, when you're writing, when you're speaking. Imagine you're taking your dog for a walk in the park and a man walks up to you and tells you, you must leave the park. Would this sound reasonable to you? What would you say if you were just walking your dog and someone came up to you and said, leave? You would, well, I would say, why? Why do I have to leave? This person is not being reasonable. Why are they not being reasonable? Have a think about that. What if a woman came up to you and said, you must leave the park because dogs are not allowed here? Would that sound more reasonable? Yes, it would sound a little bit more reasonable. You might not be as angry with that person, but are they being truly reasonable? Have a think about that. What would your reaction be to that person? Do you think they're being reasonable with you? What if she said, you must leave the park because dogs are not allowed here? There are rare birds living here and dogs often bother them. Therefore, you are not allowed here with your dog. So that's a strange way to talk to someone, but you can see my point here. Is this person more reasonable than this man? You must leave the park. Than this woman? You must leave the park because dogs are not allowed here. Why are they being more reasonable? Which of these three people would you listen to? Which of these three people would make you want to leave the park? Well, I would argue that it would be the third person. The third person, you would listen to them because they are being reasonable. Why are they being reasonable? Because they are backing up their argument with reason. They are being a reasonable person because they are using reasonable arguments. Don't worry if that's not completely clear. It's just a little introduction. Why do some people make unreasonable arguments? So why do some people say things that have no reason behind them? They have no reasonable justification. Number one, and this is a big one for IELTS students, they assume knowledge. So these are all things that some people over the years have said to me. I remember years ago when I used to smoke. I don't smoke anymore. But after my son was born, I was standing outside the hospital and I was smoking. And someone came up to me very, very angry and said, you can't smoke outside the hospital. Now, I got angry with that person because they weren't being reasonable. And why did this altercation happen? They assumed that I knew that there were rules that said you cannot smoke outside the hospital, that I somehow knew the research that said that, you know, the reasoning behind why you shouldn't smoke outside a hospital. So they were an unreasonable person, even though I was doing something that was technically wrong, but they didn't explain why. So they were being unreasonable. And this is something that IELTS students do all the time. They state things, and they don't explain them because they assume that the person who's reading it or listening to them knows what they're talking about. You shouldn't do that. They are lazy thinkers, or the issue is too challenging. So a person I was talking to the other day said to me, the UK should leave the EU without a deal on the 31st of October 2019. They have no reasoning behind this. They didn't explain anything. They didn't use a reasonable argument. Why? Well, it could be one of two things. Either they are just lazy thinkers, not that they're not intelligent. There's a big difference between not being intelligent, having a low IQ, and being a lazy thinker. This person is actually very intelligent, but they are too lazy to actually think through the issue and explain it. They just don't want to make the effort. Or it's just too challenging for them. This is a really, 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 really complex issue. And they would have to actually sit down for hours, if not days, if not weeks, to really think it through properly. And it's too challenging for them. Either they don't have time, or they don't have the intellectual capacity to actually do this, or they don't have the focus or to do this. So this is often why people don't do this. Or they're biased. I was speaking to someone the other week, and they said, capitalism is the reason why I can't get a decent job. And I said, that's interesting. And it turns out that they are big fans of Karl Marx. They are Marxists. They are basically communists, and they are very biased towards communism and capitalism. They hate capitalism. They don't see anything good in it. So they were blaming the fact that they didn't have a job on capitalism because they are biased. And there are many, many different forms of bias. Nothing to do with the fact that this person didn't have any marketable skills or any skills that an employer would want. It's all capitalism's fault. They're biased. Or they don't respect the listener. An argument that my brother and I used to have was when I was a little boy, I always wanted to watch cartoons. He wanted to watch the news. And he would just say to me, we should watch the news, little brother. If you don't have respect for the person who is listening to you, you don't think that they deserve an explanation. You don't think that they deserve a justification, or for you to be reasonable. And the ones that I think are applicable to IELTS students are number one, number two, not so much that it's too challenging, but the people are just lazy thinkers. Again, I'm not saying that people are not intelligent, but they are not used to having to think issues through. And number three, they are biased. I don't think that it's so much respecting the listener, but a lot of people have a lot of biases towards things. This could be a cultural bias, it could be a political bias, it could be a religious bias. A lot of people have these biases and they will not explain things because they just think that's the way things are. The Bible says it, for example. So let's look at the difference between an assertion, an argument, and a conclusion. So an assertion is a statement of fact or belief provided without support or justification. In other words, you're stating what you think without providing any reason to support your view. You are therefore unreasonable. So if you state in an essay what you think, but you don't explain it, you don't support it with an example, you are being unreasonable. Why? Because it's just an assertion. Why? Because you're not providing any reason to support your view. So let's look at this one again. I think that the UK should leave the EU. This person is being very, very, very unreasonable. Why? Because they're not explaining or giving any reason to actually support their view. Show your work. How many times did your math teachers say this to you? Think back to when you were studying maths when you were a kid, and often mathematics teachers, would tell you to show your work, show how you got to the solution. So if you just wrote down the solution, they would often think that you just cheated and used the calculator, and that's why they would say, show your work. You should often show your work too when you are making arguments. So for example, this person says, I think the UK should leave the EU. They're not showing their work. They're not showing their reasoning. They're not showing their thinking. Where is the thinking behind this? Do you believe this for good reasons? Or do you believe this because you read it in the newspaper, or your friend told you, or you just have a bias against the EU? By contrast, an argument is far more reasonable and useful. An argument is more useful, and this is very, very important, and we'll look at this now. So let's have a look at this argument. I think the UK should leave the EU because I believe that every country should have complete control over their laws. The EU controls some of our laws, therefore we should leave. So this is far more reasonable and useful for many, many reasons. This person is being more reasonable because they are using reason to justify their claim. It does not mean they are right. Doesn't mean they're correct. They might be correct. They might not be correct. It's not about being right or wrong. It is about being reasonable. This person might be totally 100% correct or totally 100% wrong. That's not what we're looking for here. We're looking for each party, each person to be reasonable in order to get that objective truth. Remember, we are trying to find out the truth. In order for us to find out the truth, everyone in the argument, everyone in the room needs to be reasonable. Think about politicians. Are they reasonable people? No. Are they trying to find the truth? No. What are they trying to do? They're trying to be correct. Therefore, they never actually get to the truth. We need to know why they believe this so that we can have meaningful engagement with them and understand their point of view. Again, it's about having that meaningful engagement and understanding both sides so that we can understand the point of view. And I'm talking a lot about, different, multiple people being in the same room and having an argument. But this is mostly the argument and the reasoning that you have in your own head. When you're sitting down and writing an essay, you should be thinking about all of these things in your own brain. You're not going to be debating them on exam day, but you should have multiple different points of view in your own head, and you should be thinking about which one is reasonable and which one is not. So why argue? Why should we argue either with another person or with ourselves? The best thinkers are people who argue with their own points of view and see limitations and see things from multiple different points of view. So this helps us to understand the person's point of view. If we understand where someone is coming from, it allows us to find out the truth. And it allows us to win the argument as well if we can do that. But that's not what it's about. Decide if we agree or not. So if someone just says, I think we should leave the EU, it's very difficult to know whether you agree with that person or not if they don't give you a reasonable argument for that. Compare and contrast different arguments. So understand the validity of different arguments. So instead of you deciding what you think based on your politics or your religion or your culture, you can compare multiple different arguments and decide on each argument which one is correct. I think this is a big problem that we have in the world now, is that people decide what they believe based on which tribe they belong in. So whether they are in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or whether they're Christian or whether they're Muslim or whatever, they allow these tribes to dictate what they believe rather than independently thinking about things. Decide if argument is based on fact or not. If someone says, I want to leave the EU, you don't know if they believe that because of fact or not. But if they tell you why they believe that and they give you reasons, then you can say, actually, that's not true, or this is true. Again, getting to the truth of the matter. And explore the argument in order to determine the truth. This is what it's all about. So why do you think the UK should leave the EU? Let's look at many, 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 many different reasons for this and decide whether we would agree with this person or not. So I'm not saying this. I'm just saying this is what other people would think. So some people might say control of laws. Well, that's a very reasonable argument, and somebody could provide evidence that the EU controls certain laws. They could talk about the court system. They could talk about the European Court of Justice. They could talk about legislation. It's a very reasonable argument. I'm not saying it's correct or not correct, but it's a very reasonable argument. I agree with Nigel. So somebody might say, I think we should leave the EU because I agree with what my friend said, or I agree with what a politician said. Is that a reasonable argument? Well, not really, because this person is not thinking independently. Nigel might be 100% correct. It might be 100% based on fact, but we don't know that. So it's not a very reasonable argument. The economy will do better. So this could be based on a lot of data about the economy, but you're basing it on the future. How do we know what's going to happen in the future? We don't really. We can base it on some predictions based on past behaviors in the economy and data, which is more reasonable than just saying, I want to leave the EU. But you'd have to decide whether you think that's reasonable or not. It will control immigration. So is this person being reasonable or not? I don't know. If it's based on reasonable arguments against immigration, it might be reasonable. But if he just says, I don't like foreigners, I don't like brown people, then that person's a racist. So their argument is based on the fact that they have a bias that means that they don't like foreigners. That is a very unreasonable argument. So there are many, many, many different answers to the same question. Some of them are reasonable, some of them are not. What is an argument? An argument is an attempt to persuade someone of the truth of a particular conclusion using reasoning. Remember, when you are writing an essay, you are constructing an argument. When you are in the speaking test in part 3, you're constructing an argument. So you're using reasoning, explanations, examples to get to a particular conclusion, what you think about things. The conclusion is the point that everything leads towards, is your main point. A solid argument must have two elements, a line of reasoning and a conclusion. If it doesn't have reasoning, it's not an argument. If it doesn't have a conclusion, it's not an argument. So reasoning, what is that in IELTS? Explanations and examples. Conclusion, when I'm talking about a conclusion in the context of critical thinking, I'm not talking about the last paragraph of your task 2 essay. I'm talking about your viewpoint. All right. If you don't have a viewpoint, then you don't have an argument. This is why many of you slip up in in task 2 writing, because you don't actually state what you think. You don't have a conclusion. You don't have a point of view. Like, some people think this, some people think that, but you never actually say what you think. A conclusion without reasoning is just an assertion. So if you are stating points, but you're not using explanations and examples, that's just an assertion. That's just what you think with no reasoning behind it. So what has this got to do with IELTS? I hear you think. Why do I need to develop answers in my speaking tests? I'm good at speaking English. Why do I need to write topic sentences, use explanations and examples? What's that got to do with English? So I hear this every single day. People will come to me and say, oh, I don't want to write topic sentences. I don't want to write explanations. I'm not good at writing examples. Why do I need to do this? What's this got to do with English? My English is fine. Well, this would be like doing a fitness test and asking why you have to exercise. So if you want to do a fitness test, you have to run, you have to stretch, you have to do a few exercises, you might have to lift a few weights. Those are the basic fundamental things that you have to do in order to prove fitness. In order to communicate with someone, you need to use reasoning. You need to have conclusions. You need to avoid assertions. These are the very, very, very basics of communication. So you might not be used to explaining things and using examples, but you're going to have to get used to it, because this is how you demonstrate that you are good at using the English language. So also is very good for idea generation. By understanding how reasonable arguments works, you will be able to understand if your idea is usable or not. So if you have an idea that you can't use reasoning, you cannot develop it into a coherent argument, then you shouldn't use that idea. You will also understand what other people might think. So in order to generate ideas, often people will say to me, I just can't think of anything. And then when you say to them, well, what would someone who completely disagrees with you, what would they think? Oh, they would think A and B. Okay, there's two more ideas. What would someone who is in a completely different country think? Or what would someone who is in a completely different job think? Oh, they would think this and that. And before you know it, you have multiple different ideas. So you can also think of multiple ideas from multiple different angles, different points of view, different people from different parts of the world, men and women, students and people who are working, young people and old people. All of the seeing things from different angles and understanding other people's point of view and how they reason is going to help you with your idea generation. For many people who have a problem with idea generation, it's very apparent that they have never or very rarely think about what other people think. They just live in their own little bubble, and maybe they have a lot of biases because of the culture that they're in or whatever, and they think in one way. And every single idea or question, They just have one idea and they can't think of anything else because they're just not used to thinking critically about things. Idea development. By understanding how reasonable arguments work, you'll be able to do the following: understand multiple points of view, understand if other points of view are valid or not, understand if your points of view are reasonable, very, very important, and understand the difference between your main ideas and your explanations. Many of you, instead of explaining things, just repeat the same thing again because you don't understand the difference between an assertion and a reasonable argument. You're just stating an assertion and then repeating your assertion because maybe you're not used to actually having to create a reasonable argument. So here's an example. Here's a recent Task 2 question. Some people say that protecting the environment is the government's responsibility. Others believe that every individual should be responsible for it. Discuss both views and give your own opinion. So let's have a look at this and see why, if you are not used to thinking critically, if you didn't understand the difference between an assertion, a reasonable argument, and a conclusion, what problems would you have? Well, the problems that you would have would be you might really agree with one side, but you find it nearly impossible to think about why other people would think the other side because you've gone through your whole life just thinking that way. I believe this is what I think, and I don't care, or I'm not capable, or I'm too lazy, or I'm too biased to think of any other way of thinking. If you're doing that, you're in trouble. The good news is you can get away from that and you can start thinking differently about things. The other problems people have with this could be they might be able to think of two ideas, but they don't know how to develop those ideas because they're not used to actually providing reasoned arguments. And often this is, we look at the last example, and we talked about when you don't respect that person. I've often worked with people who are in very, very high positions in their jobs. I've worked with a couple of CEOs, and they were actually terrible at providing explanations and examples. Why? Because they're used to all day just telling people what they think and not having to actually, you do this, you do that, you do this, and never actually having to justify their position. And so it can come from many, many, many different angles why you are struggling with this. So what I would like you to think about, and you can do this below in the comments, is to think about a few questions. Why would somebody believe point number one, even if you don't agree with it? Why would somebody believe that? The first point. So some people say that protecting the environment is the government's responsibility. Why would some people believe that? Try and think about it from multiple different angles. Try and think of, most importantly, their reasoning behind that. What would their reasoning be? So instead of just thinking of an idea, try and think maybe even first why someone would think that. What would their reasoning be that it's the government's responsibility? And then that will help you actually think of an idea. And then think about, do I agree with that? Do I agree with that? What would my reasoning be? Would I disagree with that? Can I poke some holes in someone else's reasoning? And then you can do this with the other side. So this is what I would like you to do. I'd like you to, you can pause the video if you're watching the replay, or you can just take a screenshot of this and really think deeply about this. And then you can post it in the comments. So remember, this is a skill. Skills require practice. All of you are more than capable of developing this skill, but, and it's a big but, skills require time plus effort. If you don't put the time in to practice this skill, guess what? You'll never improve. If you don't put the effort in to practice these skills, you'll never be able to do it. Okay? So I'm looking forward to looking at your reasoning and seeing your reasoned arguments, and then I will comment on them. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them below in the comments too. Thank you very much, guys, and hope you enjoyed that lesson.